Week 6 is in the books. We are a third of the way through the NFL season and halfway to the fantasy playoffs. We are going to dive into the Week 7 slate, covering every single matchup, talking through the key start-sit decisions, the stats, the facts, and all the film notes you need to know to make sure those lineups are looking perfect. Tom, we are going to start off this week with one of the juicier matchups. We have got the Houston Texans at the Green Bay Packers. This is going to be on one of my TV screens. This is a must-watch game. What are you most excited about this week?
It's kind of seen, does the Tank Dell usage that we got last week, the 24% target share without Tank Dell, does that grow? I mean, that would be really key to a lot of fantasy hopes for this offense, because we know when Nico Collins out there, Nico Collins is a complete dog. Stefan Diggs has looked very good in the usage that we've seen from him this year. But there was a lot of hopes pinned on to Tank Dell. We want a second-year player to be able to take a leap. And if he can make a leap now whilst Nico Collins is out, it gets much harder for them to not involve him when Nico Collins comes back. So I'm very much keyed in on that. I'm interested to see how the running game does. There was Joe Mixon getting 16 touches last week, Damian Pierce getting 9, Ogunbowale and Cam Akers both had 2 each. Obviously, we had Damian Pierce ripping that long run towards the end of the game. He looked pretty good. So are we going to see them continue to lean on the running game? Because we know that Bobby Slowick, he loves the running game. He loves being able to lean into that. He loves being able to get to 1st and 10 and just go with a run play. And against this Packers team, I don't think that they're particularly bad against a run. I mean, they're 13th in run defense DVOA, but they're not exactly particularly great against it. They're sort of middle of the pack. So where do we go there? In terms of CJ Stroud, he scores the 7th most fantasy points per drop back against man coverage. Green Bay allow the 4th highest yards per attempt in man coverage. So there's room for Stroud to pass on this team. On the other side of the ball, Jaden Reed, he didn't get there last week. I think it was the first week in a game with Jordan Love where he didn't really have a fantastic performance. I mean, it was fine, but it wasn't kind of like the top 3, top 4 wide receiver performances we'd seen with Jordan Love earlier on in the season. But Jordan Love should have an okay game here. The Texans lead the league in average depth of target faced when they're in man coverage. Teams are taking shots on them. And Jordan Love has the 8th highest average depth of target against man. So I think he's going to be looking to drive the ball downfield plenty. I think that you're going to see plenty of fantasy passing points. Obviously, no Dontavian Wicks most likely, but the rest of the team seems healthy and seems in good shape. Josh Jacobs, I'm kind of quite cool on him because he's had the 3rd most rush attempts across running backs, but he is the RB24. It's just empty rush attempts. The Packers seem to want to pass the ball when they get inside the red zone, but I know that you're a little bit higher and expecting a bit more positive regression from him.
Yeah, I know we had a bit of a back and forth this week. I just think I've just got to expect some regression. You know, Jordan Love's leading the league in touchdown rate at the moment, 8.2%. Josh Jacobs is down at 0.9% touchdown rate. His career average is 3.3. Like, I expect that to adjust slightly. If you gave him his career average touchdown rate, he'd be the RB13, which I think everybody would be quite happy with right now. So I just kind of feel like, yeah, he's probably never going to be that RB1, but in this offense with this many mouths to feed, I don't think we'd ever expect that. But I think if he can settle in as a high upside RB2, I feel like he's kind of a solid starter every single week, and you probably feel a little bit better about him as your RB13 rather than RB24.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
And the one thing I kind of want to touch on, we talked about it a couple of weeks ago when Christian Watson went down, how this could be amazing for Dontavian Wicks and this could settle the wide receiver core. Okay, it didn't quite happen because Dontavian Wicks had some drops issues. Christian Watson has made a remarkable recovery in 2 weeks from what was expected to be a 6-week injury. But now Dontavian Wicks is out injured. I'm intrigued to see if this settles down the wide receiver room. No Green Bay player has seen over a 20% target share season long. I wonder if we're going to see Romeo Doubs as that X, Christian Watson as the deep threat Z, and then Jaden Reed being the movable piece in and out of the slot. Could that allow these 3 wide receivers to all be fantasy relevant moving forward?
Yeah, definitely. And it would be nice for that to happen. I know Romeo Doubs, some people feel like he's not got the highest ceiling, but if you're getting into the end zone, you're getting into the end zone. In terms of the Texans, obviously, Derek Stingley Jr. is probably one of the best shadow corners around. It feels like the natural matchup for him is Christian Watson, so I'm not desperate to play Christian Watson this weekend. But look, I mean, Watson's got a great ceiling every week. We know that.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of start sits, it feels like you can start basically anyone in this matchup. It feels particularly juicy.
Yeah, definitely. And Dalton Schultz is somebody I like. I think when you look at the Packers, they're 22nd in points allowed to the quarterbacks, 19th to running backs, 16th to wide receivers. The one glaring weakness is tight end position, where they give it the third most fantasy points. So I definitely would be starting him. But outside of that, Damian Pierce goes back to the bench for me, and then the Packers wide receivers until we figure out exactly what they're doing. But if you need to, then you need to.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Before we move on to the next matchup, though, remember we answer 100% of your questions. If you've got a start sit question, a trade question, whatever it is, get it in the comments below. Tom and myself will be answering it all the way up to those final kickoffs on Sunday. We're going to move across to Detroit versus the Vikings. Now, this is, again, there's some juicy games on this slate. This feels like another really exciting matchup. Plenty of startable options. Do you want to attack it first? Are we going the Lions and their bevy of options? Or are we going to say, can Sam Darnold keep it up?
Well, this is going to be one of those games where we definitely learn a decent bit about both these teams, because they're both teams that are quite comfortable running the ball a decent amount. But when you look at the strengths and weaknesses of these defenses, both teams are bottom three in fantasy points allowed to running back position. The Vikings, their pass defense ranks first in DVOA. Their run defense ranks first in DVOA. The Lions, their run defense DVOA is top 10, but in fantasy points, they really haven't given up much. It's been a long time since I think they've given up 100 rushing yards to anyone. So if you take away the running back options, is this just going to be a pass-centric game? And it would be a lot of fun if it did, because we've got guys like Justin Jefferson and obviously Amon-Ra St. Brown, who have been playing well, but they haven't really given us those kind of nuclear weeks that we might hope for. Particularly Justin Jefferson. The Vikings are 29th in passing plays per game. Justin Jefferson is 21st among wide receivers in receptions per game. So it'd be nice to really see a game just shoot out and see those guys get on the board. Jared Goff struggles against two high safeties, which the Vikings play a lot of, but the Vikings also play a lot of cover two, and Goff leads the league in fantasy points versus cover two. So it's quite a tricky one to decide where that's going to go, where Jared Goff's performance is going to go. I think a lot of people are going to be very keen to see whether Sam Laporta can kick on. He only had that one catch last week, 9% team target share, but he did turn it into a long touchdown. And at the tight end position, one touchdown is all you need to be top 10 option. And then obviously we're probably looking at no Aaron Jones this week. Ty Chandler hasn't looked particularly good this year so far, but 4 top 36 finishes out of 5 2023 games where he had 13 or more touches. So my best ball shares would very much like him to turn it around and get going quickly. In terms of start sits, though, yeah, I mean, are you sitting Jordan Addison, or do you feel like Jordan Addison can have a good game here against the Lions defense where you want to attack him through the air?
I think he could do, but I don't know if I'm confident starting him above like a wide receiver 3 flex option. I think there's other options that I'm more confident in. I really love Justin Jefferson this week, and I feel like he could be absolutely kind of a massive blow up. And he's someone that I'm looking to get in, whether it be DFS lineups, whether it be fancy game day lineups, whatever. I think Justin Jefferson, this is a massive boom week for him. Jordan Addison, I was really concerned about Sam Darnold last week, and I'm a little bit worried that we could see Sam Darnold start to turn into the pumpkin that we kind of all know he is. And I'm worried that could affect the second and third options in this offense. Whereas I think Justin Jefferson's always going to get his. And I'm just worried that Sam Darnold has been playing some okay ball, but he's taken a lot of risks and got incredibly lucky so far this year. And I just feel like at some point that's going to turn. And he's not going to have missing throws, bad throws, dropped interceptions every single week.
Yeah, I think I'd feel a little more concerned about Sam Darnold if Aiden Hutchinson was out there. Like without him, it's such a big loss to the Lions. There was a lot of rumors that they've been sniffing around practice squads trying to sign more guys to solidify
as well.
Yeah, and so I feel like Sam Darnold can possibly be okay as the Lions try to figure that out. But it wouldn't surprise me if he does turn into a pumpkin, as you say.
Yeah, absolutely. And Sam Laporta, are you comfortable starting him? I guess if you draft him in a redraft league, you kind of don't really have many choices.
Yeah, I think the kind of common one, which I've heard a couple of times, is people who have Tucker Craft, who they picked up off waivers, and they've got Sam Laporta, and they're trying to figure that out. I know in one of my high stakes leagues, we've got a situation which we don't have Sam Laporta, but we're stuck in that kind of similar situation where we've got Tucker Craft, who looks good, but you don't know quite what you get in week to week. And do you start him over the guy you drafted as like a top 7, top 8 player? So I think I'm kind of okay with Sam Laporta this week because, again, the way to get at the Vikings is also through the air. They've allowed the 8th most fantasy points to the tight end position, but I wouldn't feel particularly great about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And before we get on to the next matchup, if you haven't yet, hit that subscribe back button. We're back here every single week, breaking down every single matchup, every single game, and every single start-sit decision you will have. We got another London game this week. Jacksonville stayed in London for the week and have been there 5 days ahead of the Patriots. Does that play anything into your decision ahead of this matchup? That key adjustment to the time zone?
Well, yeah, because generally speaking, I feel like, and I'm sure somebody's looked into it, but I feel like the teams who arrive later in the week don't tend to perform as well as the teams who arrive early in the week. Now, maybe I'm wrong about that. I feel, as I've said that, I feel like maybe the Bears did arrive on Thursday last week and they performed just fine. They were facing the Jags, who the Jags are just giving up everything to everyone at the minute. When you kind of look at fantasy points allowed to opponents, the Jags, they are top 9 in fantasy points allowed to all positions, including the first most QB fantasy points, second most wide receiver fantasy points. And I'd be tempted to bet straight up on the Patriots for this one if Drake May is healthy. I mean, we know on Wednesday he left practice with was going to get an MRI. There didn't seem to be a huge amount of concern around him, but anything which requires an MRI and then you're flying 5 hours, 6 hours, or whatever to London, that doesn't feel incredible. It would be really good to see Drake May against this defense because of how poor they are. Like last week, he went out, put 240 passing yards, 3 touchdowns, 19.5 fantasy points. He was passing for 7.4 yards per attempt, adding those 38 yards rushing. And I think he can absolutely go out and deliver more rushing yards again. The Jags have given up over 40 rushing yards to both Josh Allen and Caleb Williams. In terms of the Jags side, we want to see more from Brian Thomas Jr. We want to see more from the running game because you can run on the Patriots. They've allowed the 5th most running back fantasy points. The Patriots play the 4th most cover 2. They allow an 84% completion rate in it. Trevor Lawrence averages the 2nd most fantasy points versus cover 2. So if Trevor Lawrence is looking for a get-right spot, this feels like more of an opportunity than it was against the Bears pass defense, who were excellent.
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, look, I was a big Drake May fan coming out, and I think last week he excelled all of my expectations. I thought he was far better than we could have hoped. This potential MRI that he's getting done today absolutely scares the living daylights out of me. I'll be honest. This feels like it could be a JJ McCarthy 2.0 situation, but time will tell on that. With the Jacksonville wide receivers, obviously Gabe Davis, I thought had a really poor game last week, but got there with the 2 touchdowns. Brian Thomas Jr. was very quiet. Do you think that we know Christian Gonzalez is, a very good corner? Do you think he's potentially going to follow Brian Thomas and have another bad week this time around?
I mean, well, why would you follow Gabe Davis? Like, we've just not seen enough from Gabe Davis to justify it. Whereas Brian Thomas Jr., you're talking about a guy who, yeah, he was a bit quiet last week, but in the previous 2 games was a top 10 fantasy option. So it would make sense to pair those 2 up. And if that happens, then I guess you're looking more towards Evan Ingram, Christian Kirk. Christian Kirk didn't look particularly. I think Christian Kirk and Evan Ingram, where they work best, it overlaps too much for them both to be having great fantasy performances at the same time, particularly this year with the guys on the outside. So I'm not overly high on Christian Kirk, despite those 2 weeks where he was a really good fantasy starter. But I mean, I don't particularly like Evan Ingram either. And I don't think that the Patriots, in terms of the points allowed, we've only allowed the 19th most points to the tight end position. But look, if you need to start Evan Ingram, you need to start Evan Ingram. In terms of the running back position, the Travis Etienne situation seems very weird. His hamstring was so tight that he needed to leave the game, but then on Wednesday he was able to practice in a limited fashion. Tank Bigsby, the big question mark over him is whether, if he is out there as the lead back, how much work is he going to get? Because last week Dearness Johnson led the Jags running backs with 55% snap share. It seems that Bigsby probably isn't who they want out there on third downs as often as we might like.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't quite understand it myself. We saw Tank Bigsby 2 weeks ago take a screen pass 30 odd yards. He's useful in the receiving game. Yes, he's not a guy that's going to line up outside and break down linebackers with great route running, but in the Derrick Henry mold of you can check down to him and he'll probably do something open space, I think he's more useful than perhaps the Jags realize and are using him as. The next game we're going to talk about, though, the very disappointing Philadelphia Eagles versus the potentially upstart New York Giants. Where do you want to start here, Tom?
Well, let's talk about how disappointing the Eagles are, because they're kind of getting it done and they're surviving. And, you're seeing Nick Sirianni generating headlines about himself rather than how poor the offense is, because the offense just really isn't clicking in a way that we'd like it to. Obviously, Saquon Barkley started the year red hot. And then you dealt with the wide receiver injuries, and everything about it just feels unsustainable in certain ways. Like AJ Brown had a 38% target share last week. I think that he's fine this week and in line for another decent week. Devonta Smith will probably have a good week, but I just don't think that we're really seeing the kind of Eagles side of a couple of years ago, or even early last season when AJ Brown was being talked about as an MVP sort of candidate. Jalen Hurts has a career low 3.7 yards per carry and just looks slow when he's running the ball. I don't know what that's about, because the injury he had at the back end of last year should be well and truly done with. That was a bone bruise. It wasn't something like an ACL injury, which would have lingering effects. The Giants' opponents do average the third highest pass rate over expected. Teams want to pass on them. They're a reasonably good run defense. They're not anything necessarily special. They rank 9th in run defense DVOA, but teams are finding it easier to pass on them. So what happens there? In terms of the other side of the ball, Daniel Jones is the lowest check down rate among all starting quarterbacks, which kind of caps Tyrone Tracy's pass game involvement at the minute. He's had 41 touches since Gray fumbled on the first drive in week 5. Since then, Gray's only had 4 touches. And it'll be interesting to see what the split is if Devin Singletary does make it back. It was quite late in the week last week when Singletary was ruled out. I think we're getting Malik Neighbors back, though. That's where all the interest in this game is for me. The Eagles allow the 6th most wide receiver fantasy points. Malik Neighbors looked like a true elite talent last time we saw him, and I'd like to see him back out there terrorizing this Eagles defense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for me, a lot of the issues with this Eagles offense is that Jalen Hurts isn't a good passer from the pocket. We get all excited. He gets hyped up. He gets to the Pro Bowl and stuff like that. But because off the back of his rushing production, he is not a good pocket passing quarterback. If you look, there's a lot of issues with PFF, but if you look at PFF passing grade, of 36 qualifying quarterbacks, he is 31st. That is behind Jacoby Brissett, Bo Nix, Tua, Deshaun Watson. He's not good from the pocket, and the problem is that he can take deep shots to AJ Brown, and AJ Brown can do AJ Brown things and come down with the ball. But for this offense to be elite and firing where they need it to be for them to be a playoff contender, Jalen Hurts needs to improve from the pocket or go back to being that electric rushing asset. And as you said, he doesn't look the same speed. I don't know if it's that he's put on weight for the tush push and to kind of be more durable, and therefore isn't as agile and quick in the open field. But this offense, it feels like it's broken. And I'm not sure going up against this Giants D-line, which is, elite. It's got 3 great weapons on the D-line. I don't know if this is particularly a good week for Jalen Hurts.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. I think it's just, at the minute, the Eagles in general are living off reputation rather than current production, and it's very easy to see the wheels start to fall off, and you just kind of wonder who's going to replace Nick Sirianni at the end of the year.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we get to the next matchup, though, if you've got any of those start-sit questions, if you've got any trade questions, get them in the comments below. Tom and I will answer every single one of them on the run-up to this week's games. Miami versus Indianapolis. Now, 3 months ago, this would have been having fans drooling for potential offensive output. However, with Tyler Huntley under center and Anthony Richardson being, let's say, the second best quarterback in Indianapolis, is there any hope for points being scored in this one?
I hope so, because the Dolphins are incredibly poor on defense, and that's why it felt weird that the Patriots selected not to start Drake May against them rather than waiting a week to start him against the Texans. But if Anthony Richardson's going to play in this game, he should be able to put up points. The Miami defense ranks bottom 4 in both pass and run DVOA. You could definitely run on them. They allow the third most running back fantasy points. So that would be an area which I'd expect the Colts to hone in on. It sounds like Jonathan Taylor has a realistic shot this week. In terms of other plays, I mean, look, Michael Pittman's back. He managed to score a touchdown and get himself out of jail for fantasy purposes last week. But it's Josh Downs who's really been incredible over the last 4 games. He's had, a 25% plus target share in each of the 4 games. And he's been really reliable. Whether that continues with Anthony Richardson remains to be seen. But Richardson was kind of playing okay on that game before he got injured. So I do have some hope for Richardson. And this is about as soft as matchup as you'd expect. In terms of the Dolphins side, look, Devin Achan has been poor this year. He was poor even before Tua went out, and now he's going to be leaned on in a way which, is much more demanding when you've got Tyler Huntley back there. Coming out of the bye week, I'd like to imagine that the Dolphins have been able to scheme things a bit more for Tyreek and Jalen Waddle. They've tied in team target share in 2 of the last 3 games, so it's not like one of them's really getting fed to a huge level and the other one is an obvious start. The Colts, though, their opponents average the second lowest pass rate over expectation. They take the air out of the ball. They let teams run on them. So it's a little bit of a tricky one. I think you can look at Tyreek and Waddle as starts. Waddle definitely kind of that flex consideration. Tyreek, I'm starting every week. Get a load of questions about every week, and just going to keep starting him because of his ceiling. I can't believe that many teams have better options to start than Tyreek Hill. Josh Downs, I'd start. Michael Pittman, I'm kind of on the fence about. I'll let you talk more about him. And I'd probably be okay starting Raheem Mostert, but I can understand why people wouldn't want to.
Yeah, I think Michael Pittman's a flex option for me. I don't feel particularly comfortable with him. I think with Anthony Richardson under center, it always makes me nervous because he's not getting those kind of heavy RPO looks. But I think there's enough there that he could potentially be a solid, reliable flex option for you this week. For me, this matchup comes down to this is a challenge to Mike McDaniel. You're held up as one of the best offensive coordinators in the league. You've just got the extension in the offseason. You're the next hot Shanahan guy. You've had a bye week. You've had a week away to scheme things up, to work with Tyler Huntley. If you don't come out this week and put out not even an elite offensive show, just a good, above average offensive showing and produce, I think he's got to go on kind of fraud watch or something like that. Because look, you can't just blame the fact that my quarterback's gone down. It happens to teams across the league. You saw Kevin O'Connell, what he did last year with Josh Dobbs and a host of different quarterbacks. I think that this is Mike McDaniel. You need to step up, earn that new contract, and show that you're an offensive play caller that we should be putting in that elite tier. Because I'll be honest, since the second tour went down, it's been nothing but abysmal.
No, I'd agree with you. I think that's a great shout.
Tennessee versus Buffalo up next. Now, Buffalo obviously made the big trade in the week, acquiring Amari Cooper. Do you think this could kind of, gaslight and kind of reinvigorate this Buffalo Bills passing game, which feels like it's been a little bit slow over the last couple of weeks?
It needs to. I don't know whether Amari's going to get out there in week 1 and all of a sudden you're going to be looking at a passing offense that completely clicks, because when you look over the last few weeks, you've got no consistency. You've got Dalton Kincaid, who's averaged over a 16% target share in every week since week 1. Then you've got Khalil Shakir, who up and down 13%, 26%, 8%. Keon Coleman, 21%, 3%, 16%, and it goes on. Like Matt Collins, 8%, 19%, 8%. Curtis Samuel, 8%, 13%, 6%, 16%. It's such a yo-yo. And I don't think that it's benefiting the offense. Josh Allen needs that guy that he can lock in on who's going to be reliable. We know that Amari Cooper's not performed to a great standard this year. And part of it's on him. He's had some really ugly drops, but then part of it has been on the targets that have gone his way. So it would be great to see that. Dalton Kincaid is somebody I kind of really struggle with. He's got the 8th highest team target share among tight ends, but he's tight end 20. He's not really producing. We know that Dawson Knox is going to mix in for those red zone looks. So yeah, it's not fantastic. In terms of Josh Allen, this was his first good game in a little bit, and now he's coming up against the Titans defense, who just have a habit of sucking the air out of the games. They've allowed the 26th fewest fantasy points to the quarterback position, 23rd most to running backs, 31st to wide receivers, and then 32nd to tight ends. So it's not like they're a team you can go out and easily score points on. For the Titans, I think this one's simple. It's got to be Tony Pollard week. Tajay Spears is dealing with a hamstring injury. Tony Pollard's averaged 18.8 touches per game. Buffalo allow the second most running back fantasy points. They just allowed Breece Hall to go nuts on them. They allowed Derrick Henry to go nuts on them. So, yeah, I'd really like to see the team just go out and really concentrate touches to Tony Pollard.
I couldn't agree more, and that's why Tony Pollard's my start of the week. I think the Bills' second worst in adjusted fantasy points allowed so far this season. They're allowing 31.5 points to the other team's running backs. That's massive. As you said, Tajay Spears out this week. It's not official, but he's whenever someone says week to week with a hamstring, you can kind of rule it out for that first week. I think Tony Pollard's going to get all of this backfield. We know that in order for the Titans to stay in this game, they're going to have to control the ball. I think they need to keep the ball out of Will Levis's hands as much as possible. And I think they're going to force feed Tony Pollard. And I think he's an absolute smash start wherever you got him this week. He's a top 8 option for me.
Yeah, and if you hadn't got to the sheet first, I would have been putting Tony Pollard as my start of the week. I think I've got him as my RB7 in my rankings, which will be up later today.
Perfect. Well, there you go. We're aligned. It's always nice when we're aligned. Calvin Ridley, I presume he's sitting himself firmly on the bench after his, 11 target, 0 catch game last week?
Yeah, 8 targets, 0 catches, 145 prayer yards. I mean, look, he came out after the game, and normally when you get players in the locker room giving interviews and talking about having a disappointing game, they're quite balanced in it, but Calvin Ridley was just swearing left, right, and center, talking about how he needed more effing targets early on in the game. He has to be able to get into the game. You got 8 targets. If you can't get into the game when you're getting 8 targets, that's a problem, and yeah, I want no part of that.
To his defense, I would say I think 5 or 6 of them were on the last 2 drives of the game. Like, he hardly got looked at in the first. It was when the game was out of reach and they were just throwing out prayers. That's where he got most of his targets.
Yeah, but I know Will Levis is Will Levis, but like, if you want the big contract as a wide receiver, got to be ready.
Agreed. And he knew what he was signing up for. Like, he took the extra money to go and play with Will Levis. He could have stayed in Jacksonville and played with Trevor Lawrence.
Which
moving across to Seattle versus Atlanta. Now, I said there are several juicy matchups on the slate. This is another one. This feels like this could be an absolute barn burner. Seattle's one of the most aggressive pass offense. I think they lead the league in pass rate over expected. Atlanta over the last few weeks has been throwing the ball at will. Tom, does it feel like this 50.5 over under is a little bit light potentially?
Possibly. I think and there's a game which people are going to want to stack for DFS purposes naturally, and all the chalk's going to gravitate there. But I think that here you've got 2 pocket passers who haven't necessarily blown up the stats every single week, but have the potential to. Geno's had 0 games with more than 1 passing touchdown this year. That's really disappointing for a team that is passing at a heavy amount. But that feels primed to regress. So if we get a little bit of positive regression from him, then that could really push this game into a blow-up. Jackson Smith and Jigba seems to have solidified the wide receiver 2 role with a 19% team target share to Tyler Lockett's 14%. DK Metcalf has led the team in target share each of the last 3 games. So the pecking order there is quite simple. You start Tyler Lockett if you really need a flex, but generally speaking, it's DK, it's JSN. Kenneth Walker is getting an absolute monster workload at the minute. It seems like this team is ready to lean into a real workhorse running back in Kenneth Walker, and if he gets injured, then Zach Charbonnet will get the same. Walker had a season-high 78% opportunity share in Week 6. The Falcons, though, they're not exactly a team who you can get a lot of fantasy points against. Typically, they've allowed the 6th fewest running back fantasy points. Over on the Falcons side, we're going to continue to see the Bijan and Tyler Algier splits. It was disappointing last week that Bijan didn't put up more points against Carolina, but you have to take it. You have to say, okay, well, he still did a reasonable job. Algier got there late in garbage time. And what was positive for Bijan managers was that most of Algier's work did come later on. It wasn't coming early on. They gave Robinson the chance to really dominate early. And then when the game was up by 10 points for the majority, that's when Algier mixed in more. Drake London on pace for 153 targets, 108 reception, 1,213 yards and 11 touchdowns, which seems pretty good to me. He's had over a 30% team target share in 3 of the last 4. I think you can start Darnell Mooney. I think that this is going to be an excellent spot for Kyle Pitts on paper, because he's had 10 catches and 158 yards in the last 2 games. The Seahawks will have the 5th most tight end fantasy points. So, yeah, there's plenty of little nuggets along the way. The Falcons play a lot of cover 2 and allow the 3rd highest completion rate in it. Geno averages the 4th most fantasy points per drop back against cover 2. So, yeah, I'd be looking to stack this as a way to get different from some of the more chalky stacks out there.
Yeah, absolutely. And the things I'm looking at in this matchup is the running back target share. Bijan Robinson under 13% so far this year. That's incredibly low for one of the best receiving backs in the league. I wonder if we're going to see an emphasis on that and maybe slightly creeping up towards that 15, 16, 17% he should be at. And Kenneth Walker, the thing that's held him from being one of these true running back superstars for fantasy is the fact that he's not been used in the receiving game. He's had 8 targets the last 2 weeks. So I'm fascinated to see how those 2 get utilized there. In terms of start sits, it's cramming as many of these guys into your lineup as possible, because I do feel like this is going to be a really juicy one.
Yeah, Noah Fant still seems to be stuck in a bit of a tight end by committee, even though the other guys aren't really involved in the pass catching. So I wouldn't start him unless I had no other options. But otherwise, I mean, you can see it. It's all on the left. On the right, Zach Charbonnet, Tyler Lockett. If you needed a flex choice, I'd understand it in a potential shootout, but I feel like his ceiling's a bit capped.
Yeah, absolutely. Moving across to the battle for Ohio, Cincinnati versus Cleveland. Can we just kind of skip over this one? It feels like this is going to be an absolute trouncing for the Bengals offense against a very mediocre Browns defense.
Yeah, there's a couple of minor points of note. Things like Nick Chubb is possibly going to be out there, but I think the main thing that we have to take away with that is Nick Chubb had to be activated off IR this week. From when they opened their practice window for him, he had until now, and otherwise he reverts to being on IR for the entire season. So even if he's fully off IR, don't get ahead of your skis and think that Nick Chubb is going to be out there. And even if he is, he's probably not going to be seeing 20 touches. We've heard for a while that the Browns plan on ramping him up slowly. And what's the point in overloading a guy when you've thrown in the towel on the season? They traded away Amari Cooper. This Browns team, it's done for them. They know that they're not going to make the playoffs. All they're doing now is starting to look towards next year. And the Bengals should be really pleased about that, because obviously the Bengals have kind of stunk this year. They need to accumulate wins quickly. Cleveland have allowed the 3rd most passing yards in man coverage. Joe Burrow averages the 5th most fantasy points in per drop back against man. Also, we've seen Cleveland stack boxes with 8+ players at the 2nd highest rate. Joe Burrow has completed 50% of his passes against them. So it kind of comes out to, do Cleveland really think Chase Brown is somebody worth stacking boxes against? Personally, I would feel like they probably want to defend Jamar Chase and T. Higgins more. T. Higgins had a 50% first read target share in week 6. Chase only at 25%. T's out targeted Chase in 3 straight games. Not saying anything bad about Jamar Chase, but it means that T. Higgins is an auto start and someone you should be trading for, in my opinion, right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the Jamar Chase usage is very interesting. He's got great yards per route run numbers, but his target per route run number is sub 20%. He's at 18% at the moment. That's a career average is around 23%. Normally, he'd be force fed the ball a little bit more often than he has been right now. yes, okay, a lot of those shots since T. Higgins back has been stretching the field and some downfield targets, but I do wonder how this kind of dynamic's going to work as the season goes forward over the next few weeks, certainly. We're going to move over to the late window now. Now, the NFL has done it again. We've got 3 games in the late window. It's incredibly frustrating. This is because they want eyes on one matchup and one matchup only. But before we get to that, we have got 2 very interesting matchups for fantasy purposes. The Raiders versus the Rams, the battle for LA, should we call this? I think we're going to see more Raiders fans than Rams fans potentially. Look, Cooper Kupp could be back. Are we going to see Cooper Kupp 20 plus targets again?
Potentially. I mean, it would be nice to not see him needed to be used that much, because we know when they start forcing the ball to him at that level, he's not necessarily the most efficient at this point in his career with it, and you kind of PPR scamming slightly to get there. But Jordan Whittington's kind of impressed over the last couple of weeks. He's been over a 22% target share in the last 2 games, really seems to have found his place as the best of the rest outside of Nakua and Kupp. So if he can default into the Puka Nakua role, he can start getting some of those gadgety type plays, as well as playing the more explosive plays, which we're not going to get from Cooper Kupp at the moment. I feel like that's an okay 1-2 punch. I'm expecting a massive game from Kyren Williams. He had 2.9 yards per carry weeks 1 to 3, 4.8 in the last 2. He scored at least 1 rushing touchdown in every game, also had a receiving touchdown, making up for that inefficiency early. But yeah, I think that we're going to see plenty for him. I know some people will be interested to see if we see a lot of Blake Corum coming out of the bye week. We sometimes do see that bump for rookies, but I still think it's going to be the Kyren Williams show here. And then maybe you get some Blake Corum late if the Rams are able to put a lead up. On the other side, now that Davante Adams is out of town, look, Brock Bowers a 27% team target share in consecutive games without Davante Adams playing. I think that in this matchup with the Rams allowing the second most tight end fantasy points, he's in a potential explosion spot. I don't think that even with the Rams being able to key in on Bowers, that they're going to be able to stop him. Alexander Mattison's coming off a season high 17.5 PPR points. It just seems like the team trust him. Maybe if Zamir White that comes back, we see slightly less of that. But I'm all in on Mattison being a flex play for pretty much the rest of the season.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned Brock Bowers there. I'm incredibly excited about him, but he is your start of the week. How high have you got him ranked at the tight end position this week?
I've got him up to tight end 3, and I'm tempted to put him ahead of that. I've got George Kittle as my tight end 1, and then I think it was Trey McBride as my tight end 2 without Marvin Harrison out there. But I'm tempted to put Bowers up to 2, and I think that really Bowers for the rest of the way can be a top 3 tight end. And I think that it's another reminder to people to stop bitching and moaning about landing spot, because when he was drafted, people were dealing with, oh, Michael Mayer, oh, Davante Adams. Well, Michael Mayer's on injured reserve with a personal issue, and Davante Adams is in New York. So just stop worrying about landing spot and draft really talented players.
Landing spot is overrated. I say it time and time again. But yeah, I think it's fantastic for Bowers. And the really encouraging thing is the usage. We're not seeing him line up. The first week after Michael Mayer disappeared, he was having to line up in line and do a lot of checks and releases and blocking. That's not the case. Last week, yeah, he had a few of those, but he's basically getting wide receiver usage, which is absolute money at the tight end position and very, very sexy. The dream matchup of the week, though, the Panthers versus the Commanders. Tom, you mentioned one game where you think people are going to get very chalky with trying to cram as many of these players into their lineups as possible. Did I think you were potentially hinting at this one?
Yeah, and it's kind of got to be, because Washington allow the 9th most quarterback fantasy points, 13th most running back, 5th most wide receiver fantasy points. On the other side of the ball, Carolina allow the 12th most quarterback fantasy points, the most of running backs, the 12th most of wide receivers, and the 7th most of tight ends. Whichever way you look at it, these are 2 teams who can't particularly defend the ball very well. But Washington have been happy to just put their foot down and to really drive the pace up. They will keep passing. They have an incredible success rate on drives. They've punted very rarely. And that helps the other teams, because if Washington are just marching up and down the field and they're scoring, then you're going to continue to see plenty of points. And Andy Dalton's had a couple of rough weeks after a couple of impressive weeks, but this feels like the bounce back spot for them. Deontay Johnson is the only player on the team averaging over a 12% team target share. The ball's being spread around a lot. He does average 25%. In terms of Chuba Hubbard, he's had the 5th most running back touches per game since week 3. Those two guys are really easy starts this week. Xavier Legette is a bit of a dart throw, but fine. Jatavian Sanders, kind of fine. He's been trending upwards. On the Washington side, though, I mean, this QB1 overall for me this week, Jaden Daniels. He's had 21 scrambles against single high coverage, which is 10 more than anyone else. The Panthers play a lot of single high. He also has the 2nd best completion rate against that look. So, yeah, wheels up on Jaden Daniels. In terms of the depth pieces for the Commanders, Luke McCaffrey still seems a long way off fantasy viable. He's been below a 4% target share in 3 of the last 5 games. Noah Brown seems firmly entrenched as the wide receiver 2. And if you're looking at DFS lineups, I think you could put Noah Brown in there as a bit of a difference maker. Brian Robinson Jr. needs to be back because Austin Eckler, 9 for 21 on the ground against the Ravens. We know the Ravens defense is pretty tough. Austin Eckler's still got a little bit of juice in the air, but Brian Robinson needs to be out there against this defense that just hemorrhages running back fantasy points.
Yeah, absolutely. You touched on Jatavian Sanders there. I think he's a sneaky buy right now. Like he's not getting it done, but last 2 weeks he's been top 10 in tight end expected points at the position per PFF. Like I think that there is an upside there that we're not tapping into yet. And I think that he could be a fringe startable tight end week in, week out as we get down the stretch. You could probably go and pick him up off waivers in your redraft league because nobody particularly wants to roster him. And in Dynasty, I think you can go and throw a late round pick off him at the moment. Not many people are talking about him, and I am a little bit intrigued. Not in on Austin Eckler this week. Is that just a case of Brian Robinson back and you're thinking this backfield's going to run through him?
I think Austin Eckler's kind of like fringe flex viable, but I just don't think Austin Eckler is impressive in the way that some other people do. And this is my bias; it's been there all year. But I saw somebody talking about like various advanced stats that Eckler was really popping in. But 9 for 21 on the ground, that's absolutely piss poor. Like, I'm not trusting him to get it done here. And I think it's a good matchup, but I'd rather go Brian Robinson.
Yeah, I think the issue with Eckler is that for Eckler to hit, you're relying on the receiving usage. And the problem is that they have to be schemed up touches because Jaden Daniels scrambles at an obscene rate whenever he's pressured.
Exactly.
So there's not the checkdowns there. So it's basically for Austin Eckler to hit, you're relying on the Commanders going, we are going to have a high volume of schemed passes and screens to Austin Eckler, which I just don't think is going to be in the matchup this week because there's enough different areas they can get after the Panthers defense.
And the Panthers they've got no pass rush juice. So it's like you're not even trying to check it down to Eckler in the same way that you were against the Ravens, who are bringing a bit more heat.
100%. Remember, you've got start sit questions. Leave them in the comments below. Tom and I will answer them all the way up to kickoff on Sunday. The big matchup of the week, though, Tom, Kansas City versus the 49ers, the Super Bowl rematch. Although for fantasy, this feels a little bit underwhelming, I have to admit.
I'm glad you said it because that's exactly where I was going with this one. Like you've got Brock Purdy, who's got the 2nd highest ADOT in the league at 10.1 against Mahomes, who has the 39th ADOT at 5.2. He's just become a check down Charlie. And all we're seeing is yards after the catch from guys like Juju Smith-Schuster, who admittedly I wasn't excited about. I didn't think that he was going to be great. And then you've got Travis Kelce, who's at a 31% target share since Rice got injured. So it's just counting on guys who I don't think are going to be able to consistently pick up massive yards after the catch. And then every now and again, taking a shot to Xavier Worthy, who still hasn't really had a huge amount of involvement. The running back rooms now with Clyde Edwards-Helaire off injured reserve look muddled, and I don't want any part of that. The Chiefs, when they're on the, I was looking into some splits between home and road stuff earlier today. The Chiefs haven't really done a great amount on the road. The Niners have been very good at home in terms of how many points they allow. So I prefer the Niners side of things. I think, if we get Garendo out there, obviously he's going to be a easy start in DFS because he'll be quite cheap. Jordan Mason dealing with shoulder pain. can he play through it? It's going to be a pain tolerance issue more than anything else. But George Kittle, look, he leads the 49ers in target share with 21%. He's been incredibly good so far this year. The Chiefs will have the most tight end fantasy points. So I think it's not going to be necessarily pretty, but it's probably the kind of real football game that's more interesting to just watch and not have huge exposure to.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the one. You mentioned Isaac Guerrero there in DFS. I'll be honest, I don't think I'll be touching him. I think if Mason's out, this is going to be a split between Guerrero and Taylor. We saw it when Mason went out last week. Also, the Chiefs are first in adjusted fantasy points allowed. They're allowing less than 10 points total to the running back position. Like, yes, we know that this Shanahan scheme is phenomenal and he can turn, water into wine. We know that Guerrero is a freak athlete who can take any touch to the house. But I just don't know if I can get there against this Chiefs defense, which is elite. So, yeah, I like the receivers. I think you've got to start the tight ends. I like Debo. I like Juju. I like Ayuk in this matchup. But I don't know if I necessarily want to touch any of the running backs, quite frankly.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of comes down to price. I haven't looked what price Guerrero is on DraftKings or Fantasy Game Day yet, but like if he's cheap enough and we're going to get volume, I mean, he had 99 rushing yards on 10 attempts last week. And even if he's splitting a bit of time, we've seen Shanahan be able to scheme up guys. I mean, look, Jeff Wilson was a nobody before Shanahan.
Hey, don't talk about Uncle Jeff like that.
Like, Jeff Wilson had done nothing. He'd been cut by multiple teams before he got to the Shanahan scheme. So I would be okay with it, but yeah, I wouldn't be expecting a ceiling outcome from him. Definitely, like if you're playing in a massive tournament, that's not where I would be playing Guerrero.
Yeah, of course. Well, there was the big blockbuster trade that nobody saw coming. It shocked the entire world. Davante Adams forced his way to his old friend Aaron Rodgers and the New York Jets. Does that adjust anything in this matchup? And I guess for the Jets offense, how do you see things rolling forward with a potentially 25-30% target share guy dropped into the mix?
Well, obviously, it's a massive disappointment for Garrett Wilson, who'd had target shares of 40% and 28% in the last 2 weeks. It's probably disappointing to anybody who found a semi-reliable starter in Alan Lazard, who's at an 18% target share on the year. It probably kills any hope for Tyler Conklin. It's going to eat into Breece Hall's target share slightly as well, because Davante Adams is one of those guys who can get open near the line of scrimmage, and Aaron Rodgers is going to trust him, So I think we're going to see more pass attempts from the Jets, but it's not really inspiring to me, because I think we're counting on a relationship from several years ago to still be excellent, but two guys who are on the back nine of their career, like Davante Adams had dropped in loads of efficiency stats over the last couple of years. Aaron Rodgers hasn't looked particularly good for a few years now. And the Jets, if their defense starts to positively regress like we think should be possible under Ulbrich, then are you really going to get the kind of passing volume that we'd like? The Jets already, their opponents allow the average the fourth lowest pass rate over expected in games against them. I don't think that this is a particularly classic matchup, because the Steelers are a good defense. They play the second most single high, which Aaron Rodgers is 23rd in QBR against, 24th in completion rate against. It's hard to get excited about things on the other side of the ball, because we're going to get Russell Wilson out there most likely for the first time this year. We haven't seen what he's like with George Pickens. Pickens is the only player on the Steelers with a target share above 15%. He's at 26%. Yes, we got the Najee blow-up game last week. He actually made a guy miss a tackle at one point, which was quite interesting. He had season highs in yardage, touchdowns, fantasy points, first touchdown of the season. But this feels more like a Jaylen Warren week for me. I think Jaylen Warren is very much in play. Outside of that, I don't know, man. No offense, but I've seen enough Jets in prime time, and we're only 7 weeks into the season. I didn't need to discover that they were on prime time again.
You've seen enough Jets. I watch every game twice each week. I've seen plenty of enough Jets this year. I think you're being a bit harsh on Najee. He didn't only make a guy miss; he also beat a guy to the edge and scored when he scored his touchdown. So come on, let's hype that up a little bit more. I think the most exciting thing in this matchup is Jalen Warren. We know that Russell Wilson checks the ball down at a league high rate. I think this could be massive for Jalen Warren rest of the season. If Russell Wilson is going to be the starter in Pittsburgh, I think Jalen Warren can be a plug and play running back 2 once he's back fully up and running, because we know that he's going to get that receiving work, certainly. Start sits. Are you comfortable starting George Pickens? I can see he's on your sits list. Is that just a uncertainty going up against probably Sauce Gardner?
Yeah, it's that. I mean, obviously, from the Jets' point of view, it's very straightforward. Take away George Pickens, and you've taken away the big play threat. You've got a guy who hasn't necessarily played particularly well. He's been very up and down. He's had no fantasy finishes higher than wide receiver 23, finishes wide receiver 42 or worse in 4 of 6 games. And we don't know what his chemistry is like with Russell Wilson. So, yeah, there's just no reason to start George Pickens for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And the Jets don't normally shadow number 1 receivers, but Michael Carter II's probably out. He's the slot nickel corner. DJ Reed's battling injuries. So I do wonder if they're just going to say Sauce Gardner on George Pickens and we'll sort the rest out after that and not worry about anything else. Moving across to the Monday Night Football, though, we have got another double header, but there's only one game that really matters, isn't there, Tom? Baltimore versus the Bucs. This feels like a really, really fun matchup to watch, but also for fantasy.
Yeah, and like when I started piling together notes on this game, it just seemed every note that I was writing down was a note that just pushed this further and further towards fantasy points. Like Tampa Bay play the second most cover 4. Lamar leads all quarterbacks in fantasy points per drop back versus cover 4. Tampa Bay put 7+ men in the box at the second highest rate. Lamar has 5th highest yards per attempt against said looks. He's got 6 touchdowns, which is second most against them, 3rd highest QBR. They blitz a lot. Lamar's going to his first read at the 5th highest rate this year, which means good news for Zay Flowers, who's been leading the team in first read looks. Lamar's been excellent at avoiding sacks when teams have put 7+ men in the box. He's got the 7th lowest pressure to sack rate. He leads the league in fantasy points per drop back against 7+ men. So it's like I could go on. I've got more and more of these, but I think you're looking at a really good situation for Zay Flowers, who's had over a 25% target share in 5 or 6 games. Rashad Bateman has stacked a couple of really good games back to back, and the Bucs have been quite poor on pass defense this year. Derrick Henry, 17-game pace of 22.5 touchdowns. Like, I'm just not betting against him. Those left toss plays that they've been using to close games out have been so effective that even if Derrick Henry doesn't get there for 3.5 quarters, he can still pull a 50-yard run late in a game and look really good. I'm starting Mark Andrews. I'm not starting Isaiah Likely. I think when you look at his finishes over the course of this year, tight end 1 in week 1, everyone splurged all their fantasy waiver budgets. Since then, tight end 22, 51, 30, tight end 4 when he got the 2 touchdown game against Bengals, and then tight end 26. He has no games over 27 receiving yards since week 1. On the Bucs side, Chris Godwin, exactly what we talked about all offseason, exactly what we wanted. Target hog, 27% target share this season. Mike Evans at 20%. Ravens opponents average the 2nd highest pass rate over expectation, which bodes really well here because they should be passing the ball, because running the ball on the Ravens isn't particularly easy. The Ravens allow the 3rd most QB fantasy points, 5th fewest running back, the most wide receivers, and the 6th tight ends. So start everyone apart from the running backs on the Bucs side.
Yeah, happy days. And I do think the tight end position for the Ravens is fascinating at the moment because Likely's getting higher snaps, higher routes and things like that. But it does feel like Andrews, we had the car crash, we had the recovery from the injury, and I just wonder if he's starting to round in form and could be good going forwards. On the Ravens side, Tom, we know we're starting the triplets in Lamar, Derrick Henry, Zay Flowers. How do you feel about those secondary options? You said about the tight ends, but Rashad Bateman, back-to-back really impressive weeks. Is he sneaking his way into your top 36 wide receivers and a startable option this week?
Look, I don't want to brag, but Rashad Bateman was in my top 36 wide receivers last week on my expert consensus rankings, and I got his fantasy finish exactly right with no variance whatsoever. When you look at the last 4 weeks, he in week 3 was tied with Zay Flowers with a 26% team target share. Week 4, it dipped. Then week 5, 19%. He was second on the team in target share. And then last week was tied for second with Likely and Andrews. He's established himself. It seems like Lamar really trusts him. He knows when to throw to him. Bateman's getting open, and it's just somebody who I think in deeper leagues is an easy start. On shallower leagues, maybe still you have some questions.
Absolutely. And then the final matchup on the slate for Monday Night Football, the Chargers versus the Cardinals. Looking like no Marvin Harrison Jr. in this matchup. Does that good things for Trey McBride, or do you think this could potentially cause more issues for a Cardinals offense that feels like it's starting to sputter?
Yeah, it's been really disappointing what we've seen from the Cardinals. And obviously, Marvin Harrison has that extra day to get healthy because this is the Monday night game. It's the later Monday night game. So he's got all the time he possibly could have to get healthy for this one. But McBride probably needs him to be out because McBride is sixth among Cardinals players in red zone catches with only one. Like, McBride really should have seen some positive touchdown regression by now. But it's not a great matchup. The Chargers have been really good at taking the air out of games. They run the ball. That's the Greg Roman way. Their defense has been pretty decent. And you're talking about a team that allow the 6th fewest quarterback fantasy points, the 4th fewest to running backs, the 6th fewest to wide receivers, and then middle of the pack against tight ends. So if it was going to be anyone, it makes sense that it would be Trey McBride who was the best matchup. On the other side of the ball, look, Kyler, I mean, his splits between the first and the second half, I put out some tweets about it this week, and he basically drops in yards per attempt. He drops in fantasy points massively. He drops in QBR massively. He just seems to go into his shell the more the game goes on. He's at the point where he's barely a QB1 for me. I think if he doesn't finish as a QB1 this week, he's going to be somebody else struggle to rank as a QB1 going forward. Not that I'm particularly high on Justin Herbert, though, because Justin Herbert has, just been absolutely bland for fantasy purposes this year. The Cardinals do allow the 4th most QB fantasy points, but like last week felt like such an anomaly for the Chargers. They had the highest pass rate over expectation of the year, and they were still at minus 3.9%, 22nd across the league. So instead of being 32nd like they normally are, they were 22nd, and it felt like this amazing day. Lad McConkey dealing with issues. I think he's got a bad back, as well as like possible concussion he got checked for last week. Quentin Johnston, hamstring issues. Josh Palmer is Josh Palmer. I think, if you really need a deep ad, Josh Palmer is kind of fine. But generally speaking, there's nothing too inspiring here. I know everyone wants to talk about Kamani Vidal and that one wheel route, which looked incredible. Look, when you go out there and your first touch of your NFL career is a play like that, fair play. But look, J.K. Dobbins in the previous 2 matchups against the Chiefs and Steelers was going up against top 5 run defense in DVOA. And then he played the Broncos, who were the 6th ranked team in run defense DVOA at the time. And he had a really good game. I think that we're going to see J.K. Dobbins have a fine game here against the Cardinals, who allow the 10th most running back fantasy points.
Yeah, I think everybody wants Kamani Vidal to happen, but I don't see a world where Kamani Vidal is startable unless there's J.K. Dobbins injury, quite frankly. I just think that this backfield is going to be Dobbins's, and Vidal might drop in with a little nice rush or a nice bit of receiving work every now and then, but I don't see a world where he's going to get a big enough opportunity share to command any sort of decent workload.
It's going to be week 16, and people are still going to be saying, oh, J.K. Dobbins could get injured at any time. Like, look, J.K. Dobbins has played fine, been healthy ever since the season started. As far as I'm aware, he's barely missed any practices or been limited. Like, we just kind of have to give him a little more leeway than we're doing at the minute.
Yeah, 100%. And the final matchup of the week, the Thursday night game. Tom, this is absolutely disgusting. Can we just skip over it? We got no Chris Olave, no Rashid Shaheed, no Derek Carr. Can we just say start Alvin Kamara, start Javonte Williams, and that's basically it?
Pretty much. I mean, Alvin Kamara has been pretty poor for the last couple of weeks, which is what's going to happen when your starting center goes out. He's averaged 2.7 yards per carry over the last couple of games. He can get there on pass game involvement. Kendry Miller didn't play a single offensive snap last week, so it remains to be seen where on a short week the team look to get him involved more. Spencer Rattler, very variable QB. Obviously, you don't really want to be starting anyone that you don't need to. On the other side of things, the Broncos, Javonte leads all running backs in touches without a touchdown at 79. No other player is over 70. Lucas Kroll's worth a quick mention. 3 targets on 88% of snaps played. No other tight end on the team played over 17% of snaps. Greg Dulcich has been a healthy scratch for the last 2 weeks. Cortland Sutton's kind of fine. When he gets in the end zone, you'll be able to play him. Bo Nix, second in scramble rate with 152 yards and 2 touchdowns. But when he's not scrambling, he's not really going to do enough for you.
Absolutely. And that's it. The slate is over. That concludes us for the week. If you haven't hit the like, hit the subscribe, stick around because Tom's got some DFS on content. We, of course, got the game day preview over on the Fantasy Sanctuary game day feed, but we will be back next week.